Good evening. Thanks so much for signing on to our live vaccine Q&A. I want to welcome everyone and thank you for joining this community conversation to discuss the safety and efficacy of the COVID-19 vaccines. The vaccine distribution process has been going really well in our community. In fact, of all the counties in Nebraska, ours has had some of the highest rates of individuals who are willing to take the vaccine. Over 69,000 first doses and over 37,000 second doses have been given locally, thanks to the incredible organization and expertise of our Lincoln-Lancaster County Health Team. And while the uptake of the vaccine has been high, my team and I are still hearing from a diverse cross-section of our community who have questions about the vaccines, particularly as new vaccines are approved. And so tonight's event is one of the ways that we are making a real concerted effort to answer these questions, to address valid concerns, and to ensure that all residents of Lincoln and Lancaster County have the information they need to make informed decisions about their health. Which is why I'm so pleased and honored to be hosting Dr. Josh Sharfstein, who I've had the pleasure of getting to know over the last year. He's been a leader in public health and a responsive resource for mayors across the country as we've worked to rapidly understand the virus and deploy tactics to prevent its spread. I've invited him to Lincoln tonight to speak to our community today to share his unique and insightful perspectives on the development of vaccines. And Dr. Sharfstein is the Vice Dean for Public Health Practice and Community Engagement and a Professor of Practice in Health Policy and Management at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. He's also served as the Principal Deputy Commissioner of the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, also known as the FDA, from March 2009 to January 2011. And when he was at the FDA, he oversaw the agency's successful performance management and transparency initiatives. Dr. Sharfstein, thank you so much for your service to our country, and thank you for being with us tonight. Over to you.
It's my pleasure, Mayor Baird, and thank you so much for having this fantastic forum. You're absolutely right. Answering people's questions is one of the most important things that we can do right now, so people really understand what these vaccines are all about. I'll just say a few things because I'm really excited to have this discussion with you all. And I think we can go back to a year ago when we didn't know what was happening. We had a new virus that the entire world had not seen before, that all of us were susceptible to. We didn't know how dangerous it was. We didn't know what would happen. We were hearing about people getting very sick. New York was getting hit extremely hard. And there was just a lot of uncertainty, and it's been a really tough year. And at the beginning, extraordinary steps were taken. Over the course of the year, those steps were modified as best as possible to try to muddle our way through. And the whole time, people were wondering, what does the end look like? What does it look like? And one of the critical points, though, was we're sacrificing, we're taking all these steps, we're wearing masks, or we're not seeing loved ones, we're doing things that we ordinarily would never do. Why are we doing that? It's to give science time to help us find a way out of this. And that was one of the major reasons, because with time and research, we could find solutions that would protect us. And here we are now a year later, and really it is fantastic that we have the benefits of that scientific research. We have vaccines that are highly effective at preventing illness with COVID, preventing hospitalizations, and preventing death, and really are a path for us to end the pandemic and not just return to exactly the lives we had before, but return to the things that we love to do, and with a new sense of what we can do together to protect ourselves and to be safer and healthier as a community. So I think that this is just so different. And with Mayor Baird, was one of the leaders of all the mayors who were working together on COVID, and she's taken some very courageous stands during this pandemic. She's advocated for using the best science, but it was a long time. I mean, there were so many very difficult moments along the way, and here we are at a moment. It doesn't surprise me that Lincoln is doing well with the vaccine, but I think you can't just rest on well alone, just like you're doing here. You want to get questions out, get questions answered, make sure people understand what these vaccines are about, and hopefully encourage people to take the vaccines that are now available because of their benefit, not just to us individually, but to all the people in our communities.
Just keep me muted. Thank you.
I think you might be muted.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm unmuted now. Thank you so much, Dr. Sharfstein. And
no problem. I should say, I think the sentence of 2020 is, I think you might be muted.
for sure.
So.
Well, part of the success and so much of the success is owing to the incredible individuals who call Lincoln home and the many leaders who have shined a light on the truths that help inform our safety and the protection of our loved ones. And I'm so thrilled to have so many of those leaders here tonight. I want to introduce you to our panel. We've asked them to join us to ask their own questions or questions on behalf of the communities who they serve. And so at this point, I'll just go around and call on each of our panelists, ask each one individually to unmute, introduce themselves, and tell us what they do. And we'll start with Romeo Guerra. Romeo, over to you.
Thank you, Mayor. Appreciate it. I appreciate being on this panel and an opportunity to get some information out to the public, particularly to the constituents that I serve mostly, which is the Hispanic Latino population here in Lincoln and Lancaster County. I am the director of El Centro de las Americas. Welcome here, Dr. Sharfstein. So do you want me to go ahead and ask the question or just go through the rest of the panel?
We'll go through the rest of the panel and then we'll come around and I'll call on each of you individually to ask questions. Thank you so much, Romeo. Mm-hmm. Tim Timmons, you're up next.
Thank you, Mayor. Appreciate the opportunity to be on. I'm Tim Timmons. I'm the Communicable Disease Program Supervisor with the Lincoln Lancaster County Health Department and very actively involved with the pandemic since the beginning. A little over a year ago is when we began getting active regarding the pandemic, regarding COVID.
Thank you for your leadership, Tim. Next, I hand it over to you, Mr. Dwayne Mays.
Thank you, Mayor. I'm Dwayne Mays. I'm president of Lincoln Branch NAACP, and the clientele that I serve are people who are somewhat disadvantaged. Many of them are around the county, and so it's a great opportunity to sometimes speak on their behalf and to serve them.
Thank you for what you do. Thank you. Professor Anna Shavers, let's hear from you.
Hello, I'm Anna Shavers, and I'm a professor at the College of Law at UNL. I'm also the Associate Dean for Diversity and Inclusion. Right now, I'm also serving as one of the co-leaders of the UNL Journey of Racism and Anti-Racism. And one of our focuses is really how a number of different things are affecting not only people of color at UNL, but also people of color in the community, which of course also involves COVID-19.
Thank you for your important work, Professor Shavers. And last but not least, Pastor Tremaine Combs. Welcome. Why don't you unmute and tell us what you do here in Lincoln?
Hello, everybody. My name is Pastor Tremaine Combs. I'm the pastor of the Mount Zion Baptist Church here in the city of Lincoln. Fun fact about our congregation, we are the third oldest Black congregation, Christian congregation in the state of Nebraska. An AME church in Lincoln and an AME church in Omaha are the oldest churches. I'm also representative of the Progressive Ministers Alliance of Lincoln, the Black Clergy Alliance of Lincoln, and the Lincoln Black Chamber of Commerce and Economic Development.
Thank you so much for your leadership. And at this point, we're going to start our Q&A. And first, I will hand it over to Romeo Guerra, who's going to kick us off with that first question for Dr. Sharfstein. Romeo, over to you.
Nope. Unfortunately, I think you might be muted.
I swore I wasn't going to do that, but I did. Okay. Thanks again. What are the COVID-19 vaccines and how do they work?
Well, first of all, thank you. And thank you all for coming, because I totally appreciate all the work that you do and just the incredibly important and difficult year this must have been for you to lead through these different challenges, whether on the university campus, the health department, NAACP, the church, or a community organization. All of society has played such an incredible role at this unbelievably difficult time. There are 3 authorized vaccines right now. There's one made by Pfizer, one made by Moderna, and one made by Johnson & Johnson. And, I should point out that, when this all started, we didn't, typically vaccines take longer to make than just a year. And there were some pretty important questions about whether we would even get a vaccine. If you think about HIV, it's been a long time and there's no vaccine. So we didn't know for sure that a vaccine could ever be made against this new virus. And there was a lot of questions about how long it would take. And what happened, there was a few key questions right at the beginning. Some people suggested, we shouldn't do the usual testing for vaccines. It's just such a crisis. We should just do, we should test vaccines just to see whether people make antibodies. And then at that point, we should just start vaccinating people, not even knowing whether it works against the disease. And what wound up happening was the government put a lot of money into supporting the development of vaccines. And by putting a lot of money in, they were able to condense the time frame by taking out the spaces between each of the steps. But at the same time, they made a decision to make sure that each of the steps of vaccine development happened, just like it would for any other vaccine. So what do I mean? Typically, you would do a phase 1 trial if you were a company, and then you'd wait to see the results. If the results were good, then you'd start planning your phase 2 trial. It might start 6 months later. You have to raise more money. And then if that were good, you'd take a long time to plan your phase 3 trial. And it would just take a long time to do that. But what the government did was, and this was under the Trump administration, it was called Operation Warp Speed. And what they did was they said to the companies, why don't you start with your phase 1 trial and prepare to move right to phase 2. So the day you figure out whether that first trial worked, you don't have any lost time. You can just jump right to the next phase. And if it turns out that phase 1 didn't work, then only the government's lost money. You won't go to the phase 2 because you can't do it, but we'll put the money up. The government will go at risk. The company doesn't have to go at risk. And by doing that, they took out the blank space between the different parts of the development process. And that allowed a process that would typically take a few years to happen just in 1 year, but without missing any of the important parts. And in fact, the studies that were done to assess each of these 3 vaccines had tens of thousands of patients. They were the full-size study, no corners cut in all the work that was done there. And so how did they work? They've been tested for safety. They've been shown that they cause antibodies to be formed against the virus, and they've been shown to reduce COVID disease, COVID hospitalizations, and even there's really compelling data on reduction in deaths. And so the Pfizer and Moderna use a technology called mRNA. And that technology works by basically putting a little snippet of mRNA in a little bubble of lipids, which is like a little fat bubble, very little. And the vaccine works by training your immune system. It takes a piece of the virus, essentially takes a piece of the virus and trains your immune system to recognize the virus so that if you actually meet the whole virus, then the immune system jumps on it before you get sick, and certainly before you get very sick. So the concept of a vaccine is you take a piece of something, you train the immune system to be ready when it sees the whole thing. And so the Pfizer and Moderna, they create the piece through what's called mRNA. The Johnson & Johnson creates that little piece through a inactivated virus and a little piece of DNA. And what that does is it trains the immune system to be ready to see the full virus, and that's how it works. The Pfizer and Moderna require 2 shots to do that. The Johnson & Johnson requires 1 shot to do that, and the result is that I'll point out by just having that little piece, none of these vaccines have coronavirus in it. It's impossible to get sick with COVID by getting the vaccine because it only has one little piece. But it's that piece, which is the spike protein, or the genetic material to make the spike protein. That little piece trains your immune system to recognize the whole virus. And that way, when you actually come in contact with the virus, you've got antibodies, you've got immune cells, they're all ready to block the infection before it really hurts you.
Thank you for explaining how the vaccines work. And it's so reassuring to know that no corners were cut with regard to safety during the development of the vaccines. So, and thank you, Romeo, for asking that question. Next, we'll go to Tim with a really interesting question about how the FDA determines if vaccines are safe.
Yeah, a common question we get is about the emergency use authorization and what that means. And who decides that COVID vaccines are safe, effective, and not likely to cause long-term damage?
That's a really important question. And when I was at the FDA, I actually signed some emergency use authorizations myself. And here's the concept here, which is that in a real crisis, in an emergency, the FDA has more flexibility in deciding what tests to approve, what medications to make available, I should say, what tests to make available, what medications to make available, and how to make vaccines available. And there's a minimum threshold in the law for emergency use authorizations. The minimum threshold is that the potential benefits have to be more than the potential risks. And that is a pretty low floor. That's the baseline. And so for a test, for example, if you're going to make a test available, the FDA has to decide that it makes sense to have the test based on what the FDA knows. But for a vaccine that's going to be given to millions of people, that low floor is not enough. And so what the FDA had to do was set what the standard would be in this crisis to be enough evidence to make it very clear that the benefits were much more than the risks for people taking the vaccine. So the FDA went above and beyond the standard that you would see as the minimum requirement in the law. And they said there had to be studies with tens of thousands of patients. There had to be intensive safety follow-up during those studies. Those studies had to be diverse. And so they included people from many different ages, many different races and ethnicities. Those were requirements that were put into place in order to even get the vaccine reviewed by FDA. And then the FDA went through, and the FDA is one of the only regulatory agencies in the world that gets the raw data from the studies. So it's not the case in the United States that the companies do the study and then sort of present their final report. They actually turn over all the data to the FDA, and the FDA reanalyzes it to make sure that the companies didn't make any mistakes in the analysis. And the FDA presents its own, usually 30 or 40 or 50-page single-spaced analysis. And then they did something else this year, which is not required. So this is another going above and beyond the minimum, which is that they convened an independent panel of advisors for each of those three vaccines. And they had them discuss all the data. They got to ask questions to the company and to the FDA, these advisors, for hours, generally an entire day. And at the end, they voted on what they thought. And in all three cases, they overwhelmingly voted that they thought the FDA should make this vaccine available. Now, what's the difference between a regular approval, or a licensure, it's called? Approval and licensure, sort of interchangeable terms, and an emergency authorization. All the studies are the same, like I said before. The biggest difference that's relevant here is the length of the follow-up. And that was a good question that you asked about the long-term follow-up. So typically for a regular vaccine, the FDA will wait for about 6 months of follow-up. In this case, the FDA authorized the vaccine after at least a median of 2 months of follow-up. So there was a less follow-up time than usual. And so the question would be like, well, why 2 months and not 6 months? And so to understand that, you have to understand the FDA's and the scientists' understanding of how safety problems emerge. Many safety problems, if you're going to have one, happen right away. That's the allergic reaction. Then there are a bunch of safety problems that might happen in the first couple of days. Well, you'll see that in 2 months. And then the next phase of safety problems might come 4 to 6 weeks later if there's an immune reaction to the vaccine. And so the FDA said, have to wait to see whether that happens. And they basically said, we will not authorize the vaccine until we can see that. And there was absolutely no evidence of that in any of these studies with tens of thousands of patients. And then the scientists at FDA and the external independent scientists said, well, what are the chances we see something between 2 and 6 months? It's not going to be that immediate reaction. It's not going to be that immune reaction. We don't know of any problem you're going to see between 2 and 6 months. And on that basis, they said they think it makes sense to authorize it and make it available. What I think we'll see this spring, because now it's been 6 months, for some of these, the initial ones, they're putting together the data. I would fully expect that they'll come in and get the full licensure. But in all the time that it's been available, there have been no serious problems identified to date. So now you might say, last question. I'm trying to read your mind here through Zoom. Well, what about the long term? That's just 2 months. It's only been 6 months. What about 2 years, 5 years, 10 years? And here again, there's a very good scientific understanding of how vaccines work and how the immune system works. And there's a lot of confidence that both the scientists at FDA and the independent scientists have that it's extremely unlikely to see a serious problem out past 6 months. And the something to consider here, of course, is that now, first of all, that the FDA is looking. So there's actually quite a lot of safety monitoring, and it's not just people approve the vaccine and they, go back to playing solitaire on their computer or something like that. They approve the vaccine and they immediately are looking in different ways for any signs of problems. They can get adverse event reports in. They actually do active studies where they're comparing people who are vaccinated and not vaccinated. People can get text messages. They're reporting their symptoms, all the time in the United States, on millions of people reporting their symptoms. And the FDA looks at all of that. And the CDC looks at all of that. And they're looking for any even tiny safety issue that needs to be explored further. So there's a lot of active monitoring. And at any point, the FDA, the CDC could issue a warning or anything like that, which they've done if they ever were to see something. But in this case, nothing has appeared. I think that one of the big challenges here, when people are thinking about the unknown, you could say, well, how do you know there won't be a problem 10 years from now, or 5 years from now, or 2 years from now? In part because of the science of the immune system and the science of vaccines and the confidence that the experts have in that. But you also have to compare with the unknown of COVID. So this isn't, if there were no COVID, nobody would take a coronavirus vaccine because there's no benefit. But COVID itself has a lot of questions about the long term. There are people who have mild infections and they wind up with long hauler syndrome, where they are fatigued or they have other problems in their body. Some people have problems with their heart from COVID. Some people have problems with their lungs. And so there is an enormous amount of uncertainty around actually getting sick with COVID. And so you compare that with the incredibly small amount of uncertainty about the safety of the vaccine. And that's why you had these independent advisors saying very strongly that it makes sense to get vaccinated. I hope that is helpful to answering your question.
All of that's a big relief to hear. Thank you, Dr. Sharfstein, and thank you for the question. Next up, we have Pastor Combs. Pastor Combs, if you could unmute and ask your question for Dr. Sharfstein.
Yes, Dr. Sharfstein, my question is, what vaccines are being used in Lincoln and Lancaster County? And what are their rates of efficacy, and how is efficacy measured for each vaccine?
Great question. All 3 vaccines, I understand, are being used in Lincoln and Lancaster County. I'm sure Mayor Barrett and Dr. Timmons would nod their head if that, or start waving wildly if that was not true. In the studies, remember I was talking about the studies of tens of thousands of people. They basically randomized people into 2 groups. Everyone in the study either got the vaccine or they got a saltwater injection, but they didn't know whether they got the vaccine. And the people who were giving them the injections didn't know whether it was the vaccine or the saltwater shot, which is called a placebo. And so you have tens of thousands of people in these studies, maybe 15,000, 20,000 people who actually got the vaccine, and then 15 or 20,000 people who got the placebo. And then you look at the end and you say, well, who got sick? And if it looks like the same number of people got sick in both groups, you go, this vaccine doesn't work, you know? So what they did was they waited until enough people got sick, but they didn't know whether the people who got sick were in the group that got the vaccine or the group that got the placebo. And they do something called unblinding. They actually have a small team at the company that looks at those people and they see. And so if it turns out that they're half vaccinated, half placebo, the vaccine doesn't work. But when they looked for the Pfizer and Moderna, essentially almost everyone was in the placebo group who got sick. Hardly anyone was in the vaccine group. It was actually a 95% reduction in people getting any COVID at all in the group that got the vaccine. And when they looked at serious illness, it was even higher than that in terms of a reduction. So it was just overwhelming. And there are these scientists that have just poured their life into this technology who described the moment when they unblinded and they didn't know whether it would show that it didn't work at all or maybe it worked a little. The FDA actually was ready to authorize a vaccine with just 50% effectiveness because of the severity of the pandemic. So when they got the answer of 95% for the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, it was just overwhelming, and the scientists just were personally overwhelmed. They ran to tell their kids. They couldn't believe it. They didn't know what it was going to be. It was the most rigorous, the most scientific type of design of a study where you just don't know until you do the unblinding in order to find out. Now, the Johnson & Johnson vaccine was studied in the same way. Half the people got the vaccine, half the people got the placebo, and then they unblinded, and again, they found enormous reductions in the group that got the vaccine. It was, for any COVID at all, it was somewhere around 70% reduction. Again, much more than the 50% than that was the minimum standard. But then when they looked at serious illness, hospitalization, and death, it was even better. It looked into the 80s or 90% reduction in serious illness. And if I'm recalling correctly, I don't think there were any hospitalizations or deaths in the group that got the vaccine from the Johnson & Johnson. So just enormously successful. If you went back to the beginning of the pandemic and you said you're going to have one shot and it's going to be 70% for any disease at all, even a mild illness, and 80 to 90% for serious illness, and even better for hospitalization and death, it would just be, people wouldn't have believed you a year ago. But the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, incredibly effective. So you have now 3 vaccines, all of them very strong, that are now available. 2 of them are 2 shots, and then 1 of them is just 1 shot.
It really is miraculous. And thank you for that question, Pastor Combs, because we do hear that one a lot. Next up, we have, go ahead, Josh.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I go out with the Baltimore City Health Department on the vaccination team, and I've been involved with where we're giving both the Moderna shot, the 2 shots, as well as the Johnson & Johnson shot. And, my answer to a lot of questions from people about it. And, I think it is really incredible. People have, done so many things to change their lives to be safe. And it's like the moment that they're realizing, or they're getting that vaccine, that it's not going to be like this forever. It is such an inspiring moment. It's not, maybe the same inspiration that people get in church, but it is an inspiring moment when people realize that they have been able to get the benefit of the vaccine, and they can look ahead and they tell me, I'm going to see my grandkids, I'm going to be able to travel again, I'm going to be able to do the things that I loved. And that's really what the vaccine makes possible.
Next, we'll hear from Professor Shavers. You may have addressed a bit of her question in the previous answer, but it's helpful to get clarification. Over to you, Professor Shavers.
Yes, thanks, Dr. Sharfstein. Actually, you answered a lot of what the question was I had. It follows up on Pastor Combs' question about the efficacy that we all hear and read about. And I think some of the confusion has come from the fact of whether the efficacy was talking about the likelihood of getting the illness, or was it regarding the severity of the symptoms, but also how that relates to different populations. Doesn't matter if you have someone who is looking at the efficacy and they say, well, my immune system is compromised already, and so I'd rather have the 95% efficacy vaccine rather than the 77% efficacy. So the main question is, should we individually care about what we hear about the efficacy ratings, and should we think about it in terms of not getting the disease or the severity of the symptoms if we do get the disease?
That is a great question. So let me first answer the question of, well, why wouldn't someone want the 95% instead of the 75%, or so vaccine? And one of the challenges is it's hard to compare because they weren't studied in the same study. So it's not really a apples to apples comparison. Another really important thing is that 75% vaccine, the Johnson & Johnson, actually does even better for serious illness and death than that. So it's extremely protective. People who, and it's only one shot. So that's an advantage. You get protected sooner with that one. So I think that the general consensus is that all of the vaccines are extremely good, and getting any one of them will really help an enormous amount. And none of the vaccines, though, to your point, protect you 100% from getting sick. And that 95% decline for Pfizer, Moderna still leaves you 5%, compared to people who don't get vaccinated. So if people go out, even when they're vaccinated, and I have a friend who was vaccinated with the Pfizer shot, and she, I think it may have been like her husband got COVID and had not been vaccinated, and she was around him, and sure enough, she got COVID. Now, she got a very mild case. If she didn't have that vaccine, she might have been very sick. So it doesn't make you completely, perfectly immune, but the chance that you get sick is much lower. And then the chance you get very sick is all the way down. So it really protects you in that way. So it's like a huge layer of protection, but you still have to be aware of the coronavirus, and you still have to realize that you could conceivably get sick, and there's a chance if you get sick that you could then turn around and pass it on. So it's not perfect, but if enough people get vaccinated, and this is key, if you get enough people vaccinated with any of the vaccines, then suddenly the virus doesn't really have that many opportunities to move around Lincoln, Nebraska. And then it's just better for everyone, because the thing that really allows us to open up isn't just I'm vaccinated and you're vaccinated, but almost everyone's vaccinated. When you get to that point, you're really beating the virus, and you can do a lot of different things. So this leads to a question that is on a lot of people's minds, which is, can I stop wearing a mask? Can I stop social distancing? Like, what do I get to do when I'm vaccinated? And because of the fact that it's not perfect at preventing illness, it's still a good idea to take precautions, particularly when out in public around unvaccinated people. The CDC just recommended that it's fine for people who are vaccinated to get together with other people who are vaccinated and not have to do social distancing or mask wearing. But it really is an individual decision about, once you're vaccinated, how much risk you want to take. So my parents, for example, got vaccinated not too long ago. They have 2 little grandkids, my sister's children, who they have been waving to outside for a year. And that's it. And it meant so much to them to give them a hug. Now, my parents are, they're getting used to the idea the pandemic is starting to end. So they still wore their masks, and I wasn't going to walk over and rip off their mask. They want to wear their mask, that's fine. But they really felt comfortable giving the kids a hug. And the kids were just so happy. They didn't really care their grandparents were wearing masks. They were just so excited to be able to do that. And it was really great. And so I think the vaccines, they help so much, all 3 of them, that it really means you can start doing things different now. And as more of us get vaccinated, the whole community can do things differently.
We're all very excited for that day, Dr. Sharfstein. And then I guess we'll hand it back to you, Romeo. I think you had a question about the vaccines.
Yes. Dr. Sharfstein, you've sort of touched on this a little bit, but I think it's important enough to restate some of those things again. For example, uh, do the COVID vaccines contain the live virus that causes COVID?
Mhm.
If so, can the COVID vaccines transmit the virus?
Right. So the COVID vaccines do not contain the live virus. They do not contain any live virus. Even the Johnson Johnson, no live virus. It's just a teeny piece of the virus. And maybe we should just stop for a second and go like, what's a virus? I mean, it's kind of weird, but like, what's a virus? So, and people argue, is a virus alive? Is it not alive? I mean, it's a very, very small thing. And it basically is a piece of genetic material surrounded by a membrane. And it just sits there. And what it does is it gets into your cells. It gets into, could be animal cells or plant cells or human cells. It gets into some other cell and takes over the machinery of that cell and makes that cell create more viruses, like billions of copies. It's like breaking into the office and photocopying itself, a billion times, and basically destroying the office in the process. And in the process of doing that, all those viruses go out there and they start destroying cells all over the body, and you can have all these horrible complications. And so what the vaccine is just one teeny piece of the virus. So it's not the whole virus. It's not the whole genetic material. It's not the whole membrane. It's just one teeny piece. And that piece basically gets in your body through the shot and trains your immune system to recognize the virus because it's unique to the coronavirus. And so when you actually get the virus, when you get exposed to the virus, you've already got antibodies, you've already got immune cells ready to pounce on it. And so before that virus can take over other cells, what actually happens is your immune system tracks it down, kills the virus, destroys any cells it might have gotten into before you can have this huge problem, billions of cells, and it just shuts it down. And so that's really what's happening. It's a teeny piece. It's not alive. You cannot get COVID from the vaccine. And what it does is it just prepares your body. This is what vaccines do. It used to be, since in the 20th century, hundreds of millions of people died of smallpox, but they gave vaccines to people, and now nobody dies of smallpox. The whole virus is gone. Measles, other vaccines, you train someone's immune system, and the virus doesn't have a chance. And so it's an incredibly important public health tool. You have to study it to make sure it's safe and effective, but when you've got a good vaccine, it really helps. It's sort of like strengthening your immune system. Sometimes you go to the store and you see like, buy this, it'll strengthen your immune system. It's the vaccine that strengthens your immune system. It is training your immune system to recognize and destroy the virus if it sees it.
I like the sound of that, destroying the virus. It's all we want. Thank you, Dr. Josh. Next up, we have Mr. Mays. Why don't you go ahead and ask your question?
I'm afraid you're muted, though.
Oh.
I think you've answered part of that question, my question, but for those of us who've had the vaccine or who will have the vaccine soon, and we're looking forward to meeting with our families, and when we meet with our families, there will be people who some will probably have had the COVID vaccine. There are some who will have had had COVID and may not have had the vaccine, and certainly children who have not even had the vaccine, and some who have had COVID. If you're in a family like that, what kind of advice are you offering to us what we should do, and how long should we carry through with these precautions?
Right. That's a great question. Taking those questions in reverse order, what's really going to matter the most for when whatever precautions are left go away is how many cases there are in Lincoln. Basically, the fewer people that are sick with COVID, the less COVID that's out in the community, then the safer everybody is, and all kinds of restrictions are going to be able to be eased with a lot of confidence. Until we get there, it's really the changes focus on people who are vaccinated. So if there's going to be a big family gathering, you've got to think about who's not vaccinated. And if there's an, 70, 60-year-old relative who is not vaccinated yet, they couldn't get an appointment, they were sick that day or whatever it is, that person has to be careful. I think you still have to be careful if you haven't been, particularly careful if you haven't been vaccinated and you're around a lot of other people. The basic rules, while there's still a fair amount of virus out there, haven't changed. For people who are vaccinated, I think they are in a bit of a different situation. And as the CDC says, small gatherings with other vaccinated people and maybe a couple unvaccinated people who don't have any symptoms are going to be very low risk. And over time, and by time, I don't mean very long, in the next few weeks, more and more people will be vaccinated. Those gatherings are going to be able to get bigger. And eventually, we're going to see a really sustained decline in the virus to very low levels. And that will allow for a lot more, basically a resumption of normal life. Now, as you may know, some states are jumping all the way to saying like, okay, we're done, and in my own state of Maryland, the governor just opened all the restaurants to the full, extent. And I think for somebody who's not vaccinated, that's not a great idea right now, because there's still a lot of virus out there. And so the basic rules of the virus haven't changed. Even though we're way down from the peak of where the virus was, there's still a lot of virus. And so what I would say is it's not, sometimes people think like, I got vaccinated, tell me what I get. And what I get is not going to change. It's actually more like you get something for being vaccinated, and then we all get something as the virus goes away. So the something that we get for being vaccinated is we can be around other vaccinated people. You can, for a couple unvaccinated people, a few unvaccinated people that aren't sick, you can, it's very safe to be with them. That's why my parents were hugging their grandkids. But I wouldn't, especially for unvaccinated people, we still are dealing with a very lethal disease, and we don't want to give up too soon. I interviewed one of the top infectious disease doctors at Johns Hopkins, and I asked her about this very question for one of our podcasts. And she said to me, do you remember, she said, she told me she was a Dallas Cowboys fan. And she said, do you remember the game where the person was running towards the end zone and started to celebrate too soon, and someone came up from behind and grabbed the ball from them right before they crossed the goal line? They said, we don't want to be like that. We're headed towards the goal line here. So be cautious, slowly but surely, but we are definitely moving in the right direction, and we'll get to the end zone if we can just work together to get that virus way down.
Thank you. That was a good football analogy here in Nebraska. So thanks, Dr. Sharfstein. We're approaching about 6:15 p.m. and while we have a lot of questions that our panelists prepared, we also want to make sure we have time for some of those that have been coming in through the comments. And so at this time, I thought I would read just a couple that our viewing audience has posed and ask you to answer those, Dr. Sharfstein. One of them is that several of the virus variants have been discovered in our community, and this person asked, how concerned are you about the new strains of the virus, and are the current vaccines effective against them, and what happens if they aren't?
Great question. So we have this virus, and remember I was talking about all the billions of copies that are made every time somebody gets really sick with COVID? Well, every time that happens, there's a chance of a mutation. And those mutations change the virus. Sometimes it makes the virus unable to even infect a cell, but sometimes it makes the virus more likely to infect a cell. And when people then infect other people, that mutated virus can then move around. And so we have these different mutations, otherwise called variants, of viruses all over the world. And they're a little bit different than the original SARS-CoV-2. And the question was, how do the vaccines work against them? Right now, it looks like all three of these vaccines work against these variants. Now, it may be that you're a little more likely to get a mild illness. That percentage of that huge reduction in mild illness might be a little bit less with the variants. It's possible that some people might get a little sicker, but overall, it looks like from everything we can tell now that they still work against the variants. Now, That's being studied in great detail. Is it a big decline? Is it a little decline? Like how effective are they? You can't answer that quite yet with specificity, but the good news is it's possible to make a vaccine specifically against the variant. So if there's a variant that's causing a problem for someone vaccinated with the current vaccine, there will likely be a booster shot that you can get for that. And that whole scientific process is now gearing up. But for right now, it's actually looking reasonably reassuring that even the mutated virus is much less likely to cause a problem if you're vaccinated. Now, the last part of that question was, how worried am I about variants in general? So, it's possible, even though we haven't seen it yet, that there could be variants that actually the vaccine doesn't protect against. And that's why there's so much attention being paid to sequencing these virus strains, there's a lot of research into who's getting sick. If people who are vaccinated start getting sick severely, there'll be a lot of attention to that scientifically, and there'll be a whole response in terms of creating different kinds of vaccines for that. This is a really tricky and deadly virus. We brought a lot of science against it. It has some new tricks up its sleeve, but science has the response to that. So the really important thing now, if people get vaccinated with these shots, you reduce the chance that mutations can really happen and spread because people don't get sick. So you don't have those billions of copies being made. And so one of the responses to prevent mutations is to get people vaccinated.
So another reason vaccinated to prevent variants from even getting started. That's great insight. Thank you. Another one of our viewers asked about the testing of COVID and whether or not the subjects were paid, and wondering if there were financial benefits from this vaccine, or who financially benefits from the vaccine, and are those folks trustworthy?
Well, that's a fair question. It comes up with a lot of products at FDA, and maybe I should have started with a disclosure. I have no financial connections. I've never been paid by pharmaceutical companies or vaccine manufacturers or anything like that in my own career. The people in the study, I don't know whether they were compensated. Sometimes there's a small compensation for being in a study, but the people in the study didn't know whether they got the vaccine or not. So there was no way for them to do something that would make the vaccine look good or not. They didn't know whether they got the vaccine. And so until that unblinding happened, there's really nothing that an individual really could do. Now, the companies obviously get paid for the vaccine. That's partly why they're in business in the first place. But the companies turn over all their raw data. Their clinical trials are audited by the FDA. The FDA reanalyzes all the data. And if there are problems with the integrity of the data, people can go to jail, for things like fraud. The Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act is very strong. So we have a legal framework in this country that is designed to make sure that the data that leads to the approval or authorization of a product it has integrity. And there were not serious problems identified with any of the studies in this regard. So, in my own career, I have criticized, for example, companies for giving gifts to doctors. I did that when I was a medical student. I think that it's fair to ask all kinds of questions, but I also feel like this was a case of the industry, academic experts, many volunteers who didn't know whether they would even get sick in this trial, that maybe it would turn out that the shot was unsafe. They didn't know when they signed up. Very courageous people did this. And everything together has produced these vaccines, which, as we can see, are having a big impact. And I should just make just one last really quick point here. It's not just these studies that show these amazing things. There are now countries where they've studied, like Israel, for example, has very high rates of vaccination, and they're seeing just dramatic declines in the number of people who are sick. So even if you believed, there's something, if you believed a conspiracy about the study, now it's being used in millions of people, and those people are not getting sick. In the United States, the percentage and number of people in nursing homes who go into the hospital for COVID has dropped like a stone. And it's incredible. I mean, so many people got sick and died in nursing homes. Since the vaccine was given to people in nursing homes, so many fewer people are going to the hospital from nursing homes. So there's so much evidence now above and beyond the study. But the study, I think, had integrity, and the data was right. And it really was a great example of collaborative work across the private and public sector.
We are really grateful for the courage of those who participated in those clinical trials. One of the questions, Dr. Sharfstein, that we get at the health department more and more, given that the vaccines haven't been authorized for children at this point, is about what are the prospects for children and youth, and also about whether or not the vaccines are safe for pregnant mothers. Can you speak to those issues?
Sure. So for children, the Pfizer vaccine was studied down to age 16, and there are a number of studies that are going on for adolescents. They, generally speaking, because kids, particularly young kids, are not nearly as likely to get as sick from COVID as even older kids and adults. The idea was to do the studies of the vaccine in the populations that are most likely to get sick, which is why it's very important in the studies there are older adults too. And then if it looked good for those groups, to start to think about testing kids. Now for kids, there are some unique issues. There are dosing issues. You have to get the right dose. Kids get a very serious condition called multi-inflammatory syndrome from COVID itself, MISC, multi-system inflammatory syndrome. And so those studies are going to be carefully looking at the impact of the vaccine on kids, the safety, as well as the effectiveness. We should have the results for adolescents, I hope, by the end of the summer and maybe in time for the school year next year. And I think it's reasonably likely and believed that the vaccines will be pretty good for adolescents. And but as usual, the FDA will review all the data, and there'll be a lot of public information about what that data shows. Younger kids, it'll probably be a little bit longer before the studies are done. It's discussed. Given the very low risk of severe illness, I think it's going to be an important discussion to have and a real serious look at the data about at what point do you decide that even little kids should get vaccinated. So I think that decision is probably the last one that will be made. So for pregnant women, there is, I was just looking up the latest safety report. CDC does a lot of work. As you know, the vaccine was not recommended for or against for pregnant women. It was made available to them. Pregnant women are more likely to get severely ill from COVID. And a lot of pregnant women who have potential exposure to COVID made a sensible decision, I think, to get vaccinated because of the severe risk of COVID. And thousands of women have signed up for different studies of safety. And so far, in multiple kinds of analyses, there have not been any serious concerns for pregnancy identified. So pregnant women seem to have side effects just like everybody else. The rates of pregnancy complications do not appear higher in women who are vaccinated compared to women who are not vaccinated. And so the early data is so far reassuring on that point. And I think that's why the OBGYN Society recommends vaccination, for example, for pregnant women who could be exposed to COVID.
That's good to know. Thank you. Another one of our viewers asked about the flu and why, did the flu just go away this year? What happened? How do you explain the low number of cases of flu while rates of COVID were surging over the winter? Can you help us understand the differences there?
Sure. Well, if I'm not mistaken, you are wearing masks in Lincoln, Nebraska.
We are.
There you go. The steps that we all are taking to reduce the chance of COVID this year had an enormous impact on flu. And I think it's a cause for reflection. Like in other flu years, people might have gone to work sick. They might have been sneezing over everything. Next thing you know, everyone's getting sick. Now, people who are sick are staying home. Many people are, even if they're not wearing masks, they're keeping their distance. They're not going out nearly as much. It's just particularly as COVID was being passed around, people were taking a lot of precautions, and turned out that was just an awful lot less flu, I think, as a result of that. And so it kind of raises the question when we go back, and this is one of the points I made at the beginning, are we going back to life just like we knew it, or are we going to be a little bit more careful in flu season to stay home when we're sick, perhaps? Or maybe even, when we're feeling sick and we have to go somewhere, wear a mask, which a lot of people in many countries do. There are things that we can do from the infectious disease perspective, but from other perspectives too. Like, one of the things that COVID showed was just how inequitable our society is, that people who were working essential jobs, had overcrowded homes, or had other major risk factors, wound up getting sick and dying. We had death rates among African Americans and Latino persons in this country 2 or 3 times higher than among white Americans. And so, understanding what caused those enormous gaps and thinking about the kinds of health policies and social policies that can make everybody healthier and close some of those really terrible disparities, that allows us to think about a future with a healthier and safer and more just community. And I think that is really part of the promise of the recovery that we're now starting to see the beginning of.
I think that's the future we all want. Thank you for that point, Dr. Sharfstein. And it looks like we're about out of time here, and I want to thank you again, Dr. Sharfstein, for taking time to answer our community's questions. I want to thank all of our panelists for the work that they're doing, for their leadership, for the great questions they brought to this discussion tonight. I know that, especially in light of what I've learned from you and our panelists, I'm certainly eager for my turn to get vaccinated, and I want to encourage anyone watching to please get the vaccine as soon as you are able. Tonight's conversation will be available not just tonight, but tomorrow and onward on our YouTube channel, on LNK TV, and for anyone who wasn't able to join live. For those of you who did, thank you for coming. We're so grateful that you're taking steps to protect yourself, your loved ones, and our community. Thank you.